It's not uncommon for us to wonder what the church was like in the first century. What was the early church like? We know a lot about the early leaders, the Apostle Peter and Paul and so forth. We know about the leaders. They're fairly evident and obvious and all, but what about just the ordinary, regular, plain old members? What were they like? Were they more spiritual than Christians today? Did they experience the kind of problems that so often are seen in churches today? Well, there are several books in the New Testament that reflect the life of the early church. And one of those is the short letter of 3 John. If you would open up your Bibles to 3 John. It's a private letter written by the Apostle John to a friend of his named Gaius. It provides portraits, though, of 3 different men. And in so doing, it gives us a glimpse of 3 what we would consider to be ordinary, regular, plain old Christians in the first century. If you would, let's follow along as I read 3 John. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health, as it goes well with your soul. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for those brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way, on their journey, in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, and also stops those who want to, and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends each by name. When one examines the portraits that are found here in this letter of these 3 men, we learn that they're not much different than Christians today. That in the first century, they were people. Just like in the 21st century, we're just people. And so it helps us to understand that. Therefore, the letter of 3 John, and actually the whole New Testament, is very relevant, though we may live almost 2,000 years after it was written. Tonight, what I want us to do is, first of all, consider some background material concerning this letter. I want us to notice the difference between the 3 men described in the letter, and then we'll finish with some lessons that can be learned from this short book. But let's begin with some background information. And of course, when you look at background information for a book of the Bible, the most obvious place to start is with the author of the book. So who is the author? The author identifies himself as the elder in the first verse. Okay, that's great. Actually, it's the same way in 2 John as well. The elder is believed by most conservative scholars to be the Apostle John. Now, why do they believe this? Well, the internal evidence is strong. for John being the author of 3rd John and 2nd John and 1st John for that matter. All 3 letters of John utilize much the same language and ideas. All 3 of the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John also use very similar concepts and language to the Gospel of John. So that leads most to conclude that John was the author of all 4 of those books. The term elder also would be a fitting description of John as the author if he was writing in his old age. So the internal evidence is very strong for it to be the Apostle John as the author of this letter. The external evidence, though, is, fairly slight. A lot of times we have a lot of people other than first century Christians, but early century Christians, that will testify as to the authorship of the letters. Dionysius of Alexandria, living in the 3rd century AD, credits John with being the author of this short letter. And that's about the extent of the external evidence that there is out there for that. But really, when you have as much internal evidence as you do, the external evidence really doesn't matter that much. So we know the author. What about the recipient? My dear friend Gaius. Now, Gaius was a common Roman name. It actually appears 5 times in the New Testament. Acts chapter 19, verse 29, Acts chapter 20, verse 4, Romans 16, 23, 1 Corinthians 1, 14, and here in 3 John, verse 1. Now, whether Gaius mentioned here in 3 John is the same one that Paul knew and all that he writes about in Romans and 1 Corinthians, etc., and that Luke knew, is undetermined. It may have been the same person. It may not have been the same person. As I mentioned, Gaius was a very common Roman name in the 1st century. But regardless of whether he was friends with Luke and Paul and John, we know that he was a very good friend, a dear friend of John, for sure, because of how John addresses him in this letter. And he's known for his hospitality. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just in a little bit later. The place and the date of writing. Ephesus is usually considered or suggested as the location from which John wrote this letter. John actually is known to have lived in Ephesus later on in his life, after his exile on the island of Patmos, which he was able to return from and again live in Ephesus in the latter years of his life. The estimation of the date of writing, though, varies wildly. I mean, there are some who date this letter before the fall of Jerusalem. That would be before 70 AD. Most, however, date the letter somewhere around 90 to 95 AD, again, making it toward the end of John's life and when he was in Ephesus, and it fits all together rather nicely. But why would he write this? What was the purpose of the letter? There was actually a threefold purpose to 3 John. The first was to confirm that Gaius did right in supporting those teachers who came his way, and to encourage Gaius to continue to be that hospitable to those types of people. The second purpose was to express his condemnation of Diotrephes for rejecting John and others whom he should have received. And then finally to encourage Gaius to imitate what is good, commending Demetrius as an example of what is good and as a good example to be followed. If we were to do a brief outline, we'd start with the greeting with expressions of great joy, verses 1 through 4. Verses 5 through 8 contain the confirmation of Gaius. Verses 9 and 10, the condemnation of Diotrephes. And verses 11 and 12, the commendation of Demetrius. And finally, some concluding remarks in verses 13 and 14 and 15, maybe. I say that because there are some versions that have 14 verses, some versions have 15 verses. Oh no, that's a discrepancy, is it? Well, not necessarily, because really the ones that have 15 verses, the last 3 sentences are their own verse. In the ones with 14 verses, the last 3 sentences are part of verse 14. So unless you're actually trying to get a goal of a number of scriptures to memorize, it really doesn't matter that much. Okay, it's the same words. The chapter and verse locations are not inspired by God. So anyway, that might help you with that in case you're saying, why is he saying verse 15? Mine only has 14 verses. Well, again, it's just a difference in version. There is something to be said, though, as far as a comparison of the letters of 2 John and 3 John. Now, I'm sure that you all remember this, but way long, far back time ago, in 2016, we talked about the letter of 2 John on Sunday nights for several weeks. Well, I'm sure that's fresh on all of your minds. I wanted to do a brief comparison of 2 and 3 John. First of all, both letters focus on the words love and truth. 2 John verse 1, 3 John verse 1, he sets the tone of the letters, focusing on love and truth. But I want you to notice the difference in where their focus lies. In 2 John, love is commanded, but there's a warning against tolerating those who deny the truth. In other words, John tells the recipient of 2 John, the elect lady and her children, tells them, okay, you need to love, but if somebody is denying the truth, if somebody is not teaching the truth, then your love for them ought to be to the point where you want to correct them. You don't receive them. In 3 John, love is praised, and there's a commendation for supporting those who proclaim the truth. So on the one hand, we're to love all the time, but we're not to love to the extent of accepting false teachers, but our love should be evident toward true teachers. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. One other comparison, 2 John condemns the departure from the truth, which is known as heresy. 3 John condemns the lack of love among Christians, which results in division. So, sorry about that. That should come up there. Okay. So the books are similar in focus, but not quite in their scope of what they're talking about. With this brief background to the letter, let's take a closer look at the 3 men of 3 John. And we'll start with Gaius. Gaius is a man who would be prosperous. In fact, John says he prays for Gaius to continue to be prosperous. He is a dear friend of John, for whom he prayed that he would prosper physically, but not only prosper physically, but also continue to prosper in a spiritual way as well. John loved and prayed for Gaius because he was a man who had a good reputation. People knew about Gaius. They knew about his willingness to support teachers of the gospel. They knew that if they needed something, he would do all that he could to help them out, provided they were teaching the truth, because he walked in the truth. Verse 3, the second part of the verse tells us, he gave John the greatest joy in hearing about his faithfulness, verse 4. In fact, verse 4 may lead us to conclude that John may have actually converted Gaius and been his, what we might call a father in the faith to him, because he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. He was honorable towards all, and he was encouraged to continue his support of gospel preachers in verses 6 through 8. The second man was Diotrephes. He was a man who would be preeminent. Now, what does that mean, preeminent? There's a description of Diotrephes' character. He was a self-promoter. Okay? This is in verse 9. He loves to be first. You know, he wants to be in the spotlight, we might say. He also was insubordinate. He was not willing to accept that anyone else could be first, even if that other person happened to be John, who was an apostle of Jesus Christ, who walked with Jesus, who was one of the inner circle of 3 disciples or apostles with Jesus. Didn't matter. Diotrephes wasn't going to receive him, wasn't going to accept anything that he wrote or that he said. And he was slanderous. In verse 10, John begins by, he gossiped maliciously about us. Or as he puts it in here, he's going to, when John comes, he will bring up what he is doing against us. Talking wicked nonsense. Okay, so wicked nonsense, that doesn't sound like something you want to be talking about someone, especially someone like John. And finally, he is vindictive. We know he's vindictive because he would not receive certain brothers. And in fact, if others wanted to receive those brothers, he would not only not receive the brothers that were wanting to be received, but he would even put those who wanted to receive them out of the church. So, he had a little bit of an anger management problem, we might say. Diotrephes' character, though, serves as a warning. A warning that John gives in verse 11. 2 parts to it. Anyone who does what is good is from God, and anyone who does what is evil has not seen God. Very similar to what he writes in 1 John. So we have Gaius, a man who would be prosperous. Diotrephes, a man who would be preeminent. And finally there is Demetrius, a man who would be a pattern. Verses 11 and 12. John encourages Gaius to imitate what is good. For whoever does what is good is from God. And that's someone you want to imitate. Paul will say, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And we pattern. It's okay for us to pattern ourselves after others. Demetrius appears to be offered as a pattern for Gaius, for Demetrius had a good reputation from everyone in the church, from the truth itself. One commentator writes, Demetrius lived according to the mandates of God's word, so that his life showed clear evidence of the truth. Not only did he have a good reputation with people at church and from the truth itself, but even from the apostles and John specifically. Thus we have 3 pen portraits, if you will, of some men preserved in this letter, giving us some insight as to the quote-unquote normal members of the church in the first century. There were some good guys, Gaius and Demetrius. But sadly, there were some not so good guys as well, like Diotrephes. Not much different than today, is it? That being the case, then perhaps we should remember some of the lessons from 3 John. And there are 3 lessons that I think we can learn from 3 John. The first lesson is that Christians are not always what they should be. Does that surprise anybody? Christians are not always what they should be. We may have to serve in the face of opposition from others. Now, we know and we expect opposition from those outside of the church, from those who don't see eye to eye with us, from those who would seek to see us not be successful. We know that we'll face opposition from those outside the church, yet John says sometimes opposition may even come from those in the church as well. The important question is, how will it affect us? Is it going to destroy our efforts to serve? Or is it going to, will we allow this not only to affect our service, but if it affects our service, will we allow it also to affect our salvation? Because if we are trying to serve others and somebody from church is trying to keep us from serving others, and we don't serve others because they don't want us to serve others, then we're not serving Jesus, because by serving others, we're really serving Jesus. That's what he says in Matthew 25 anyway. So, Christians are not always what they should be. Second lesson, Christians often imitate other Christians. John says to imitate what is good for two reasons. Because those who are good, who do good, are of God, and those who do evil do not know God. So the question before us is, what example are we setting? Are we setting the proper example? Are we setting the proper example for our children? Are we setting a proper example for our grandchildren? For our great-grandchildren? For as many generations down as you want to go? Are we setting a good example for our friends that we work with? Are we setting a good example for the neighbors who live around us? Are we setting a bad example, or setting a good example even for those who don't really like us that much? What sort of example are we setting? Who are we, and who are we imitating? There's another good question. Not just looking at who's imitating us, who's following our example, but whose example are we following? You know, Rachel and Jamie, when they were little, they had a favorite babysitter that would babysit for us quite frequently. We had one lady that wasn't a member of this girl's family that would always, well, not always, but she would occasionally give Monica and I a gift card and said, "You're going out." Okay. So we'd have to find a babysitter. If she couldn't do it, then this teenager was the one that we called on. And her name was Lauren. One day I heard Rachel and Jamie playing a game. They were playing Lauren. And they were playing like one of them was Lauren. And it was, I'm not real sure all the logistics of the game and how it worked. But you know, we all do that, don't we? I mean, I can remember when I was growing up, you know, there were some teenagers at church that I idolized, and I was like, ooh, they're cool, you know. And I remember begging my parents to let me ride the Joy Bus that went right by our house home on Sundays, so that I could ride on the Joy Bus with Rodney. That was his name, Rodney. He was a cool guy, and everything. But we all do that. We all find people that we want to imitate. So who is it that you're imitating? And who are you, if they are looking to you, what sort of example are you setting? See, Gaius had a choice. Gaius could idolize, he could follow the example of Diotrephes, or he could follow the example of Demetrius. Who do you suppose he would seek to imitate? Which do you think John would want Gaius to imitate? Christians often imitate other Christians. You know what the problem with that is? A lot of times, other Christians kind of let us down, because Christians are not always what they should be. And we need to be able to know that, and we need to understand that, you know, when we have someone as an example, not everything that they do is going to be perfect. But we need to understand that, and we need to be willing to forgive when it does happen. Finally, Christians often allow the spirit of Diotrephes to reign. Diotrephes was successful because some of the members in that congregation allowed Diotrephes to dominate. He was successful because, well, some of those folks wouldn't take a stand for the truth. He was successful because some of the members would not support those who took a stand for the truth. If somebody tried to counter Diotrephes, you know, Diotrephes would bow up a little bit, and the other people would cower down and not stand with the one that wanted to welcome the brothers, but because they didn't want Diotrephes to put them out of the church too. Diotrephes was successful because there was a certain climate of complacency and even cowardice within the church. The bottom line, he was a bully. He was a bully. He liked to push people around. He liked to say, hey, I'm the boss guy here, and if you don't like it, you can just leave. You know anybody like that? I know of a guy. I hate to say it. First place that I preached at, there was a guy that he wasn't an elder because the church didn't have any elders, but his brother was an elder, and his brother-in-law was an elder, so he knew a little bit about being an elder. And so he thought he would assume all the authority of an elder. And I asked him one time, I said, you know what? I have a brother-in-law too, and he's a pilot. You want to go get in a plane and I'll drive? But no, okay. But anyway, the long and short is that there are some people who try to do that, who try to exert and overexert themselves in their authority. The best way to do that, to deal with them, is to stand up to them. Notice that Diotrephes was able to get away with his domination strongly suggests to me that Gaius and Diotrephes were not necessarily members of the same congregation. That maybe they were neighboring congregations, nearby congregations, but not necessarily in the same congregation. That's my speculation. We'll consider some more truths that can be learned from this letter over the next few weeks. And you're saying, it's only 14/15 verses. How are we going to spend a few weeks on that? And I would say to you, I've been here 5.5 years. You ought to know. Right? Okay, good. But I hope this introduction to this letter and a brief look at the 3 men of 3 John will stimulate our thinking about what kind of example that we are setting for those who maybe are younger than us chronologically or younger than us in the faith. If John had written a letter in which your name was mentioned, what would he have said about you? Would he have prayed for your prosperity? Would he have condemned your desire for preeminence? Or would he have held you up as a pattern for others to follow? If we will but walk in the truth like Gaius, we're going to have a good testimony from all. So how are you walking? How's your walk? Are you walking according to the things that God would have you to do? Or are you more or less saying, you know what, I'll serve God when it's convenient for me and no other time? How's your walk? Who are you imitating? The people in the world or the people in the book? The people at church? Who's imitating you? Who are you setting an example for? And are you setting the proper example? If not, something needs to change. And it needs to change pretty quick. It needs to change quickly because we're not guaranteed that we're going to have a whole lot more time. And if it doesn't change, then we're going to have all of eternity to kick ourselves and wonder why we didn't do more of what God wanted us to do. This evening you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to maybe just privately change the people that you look to as role models. The people who are trying to really follow the truth of God's Word. You also have an opportunity, if you need to, publicly make a need known, to make that known. But the thing is, if you have a need, don't leave here without that need being met. If we can help you through a public response to meet that need, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?